Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So this is a quick shout out to Chronocide or Chronocide Creations, however you want to pronounce that. Chronocide, one of those creations, link below. And they have kindly sent me this sparring axe. You might wonder, what is that weird thing? Well, basically, there we go, it's for hitting people. That does hurt a bit, but this is basically made for HEMA sparring, and indeed you could use it in any sort of martial arts sparring that you want to. I will do a full review of this in due course, just to say that essentially it's made of modern materials that are both stiff and bendy at the same time. Just briefly, for those of you who don't understand why you couldn't just have a steel one of these. Quite simply, when you have a sword, you can actually make steel ones, practice ones, pretty safe, pretty easily, because swords, for the most part, are poor bludgeoning weapons. That is, they don't transfer an awful lot of energy to the target because of the way that they're built and balanced, so you make them blunt and you pretty much make them safe. Yes, indeed, we have to wear sparring gear that can absorb the impact that they do land, and obviously you have to make things that are to some degree puncture resistant, so that if the steel blade snaps, it won't just run you through. But we have, roll tips, blunt tips of various sorts, blunt edges, and this basically means that we can spar with real swords with a fair degree of safety. Now, for those of you who don't realise, when you've got something like a warhammer here, then quite simply the mass is now at the end, at the hitting end, rather than at the hilt end. So with a sword, it balances near the hand, therefore it's very nimble and very quick and very manoeuvrable, much more so than the warhammer or mace or club, bat, anything like this, poleaxe, any of those sorts of weapons. So these are bludgeoning weapons, and bludgeoning weapons hit with force. Therefore, just making them blunt doesn't make them stop being a bludgeoning weapon. They're still going to hit with a lot of force. Therefore, when we want to make sparring versions of these, you're faced with two main issues. One is the sharpness and the pointiness of some of those things, which you can reduce even with the steel one. But the second issue is the impact force. Okay, now there's a couple of ways of mitigating that. One is to make it lighter, and one is to make it absorbent in somehow. So if you look at LARP, for example, you might indeed find LARP versions of poleaxes, axes, maces, things like this, warhammers, and they're spongy, but they're also very light. So you can, in LARP, you can easily make a LARP battle axe because you're making it both spongy and lighter. And indeed, compared to a LARP sword, the balance might be different, because a LARP sword might balance more towards the hand and a LARP axe might balance more towards the head. But because they're so much lighter and absorbent, it's not really a problem. When you come to HEMA, we've got an issue, because when we want to simulate things like maces or axes or poleaxes, you can't make them too much lighter, because then they wouldn't at all handle like the real weapons. And this is the issue in LARP. And, I've dabbled in LARP when I was a lot younger. And one of the problems with that, you could have a large pole weapon like a halberd, and you could theoretically hold it by the very end and donk someone from very, very far away, which realistically you can't do with a real pole weapon. I can just about hold it out at arm's length, but there's no way I could swing it or hit someone with it, because this weapon weighs, from memory, about 6 or 7 pounds. So, it has a certain a sort of movement and pattern of movement to it, a heft to it, that you can't really simulate. It's not useful to make one that's hugely amount lighter. So, what do we do in HEMA? Well, that's a very good question, and we don't have a perfect answer. But one thing you can do is you can make the heads of an absorbent material like rubber or foam or even leather. There's various different companies who've come to different solutions, and you tend to make it a bit lighter as well. So, for example, if we were making a HEMA version of a poleaxe, indeed we'd make it with a bendy point, you'd make it with absorbent heads, and there are various types of leather and rubber heads out there commercially available, which I'll look at in future videos. And you tend to make, therefore, the overall weapon slightly lighter. So rather than being 6 pounds, you maybe make it 4 pounds or something like that. But you've got I'm knocking things over with abandon here. But you've still got a huge amount of leverage, because it's a great big long pole with a lot of distance between your hands, and it's a long lever. So it is problematic in HEMA. And swords are fantastically popular, because really, frankly, folks, swords don't hit with an awful lot of force, so it's actually really quite easy to make them safe. Some swords might be an exception. The big Zweihander is a problem. Something like a falchion would be a problem. Even Langmesser can be a problem because of the breadth of the blade. Something like a 1796 light cavalry sabre might be a problem, but most of the swords we use, arming swords, long swords, rapiers, side swords, all of these types of things are relatively easy to make safe. So, Chronocide Creations have gone for something here which is a bit lighter than a real axe and has an absorbent and flexible head, but importantly it's not so absorbent and so flexible that it bends if you want to do hooking actions with it. So you can still do a lot of the techniques of hooking or parrying or deflecting with it. It's got a wooden shaft just like the real thing, but you've still got stiffness there. So, full review of this coming when I've had a chance to use it, but just so far, I'm not going to donk myself in the head because I'd be wearing a fencing mask, but so far it actually it hurts a bit. I'm not certain whether I agree with the shape of this edge, but we'll look at that in the main video once I've had a chance to play with this in actual sparring. But so far, very impressed. This is a similar solution to what people have come up with to poleaxes as well, because poleaxes are main HEMA weapons, so we have to find ways of sparring with it safely. Additionally, even if you're wearing armour, ideally you want something that's not destroying your armour every time you use it, so something that's a bit more forgiving than a steel head, for example. So, there we go. For those of you who weren't aware, and those of you who do HEMA who maybe have never thought about top-heavy weapons and bludgeoning weapons, these are the issues we face if we want to look at things like axes and maces, even flails, pole axes, any type of polearm really. These are the issues we face in HEMA. How do you make it safe, but also somewhat representative of moving the weapon at a realistic speed and in a realistic way with a realistic sort of pattern of movement and heft, like the real thing? Because if you make it too light, or in some cases if you make it too flexible, it's not going to work properly anymore for the techniques we want to do. Hope this has been interesting. Check out that link down below. Thanks very much to Chronocide for sending this to me. I will be using this imminently. I'll probably be using it tomorrow night in training actually. So looking forward to some fun with this. Any comments, any other suggestions, other products, that kind of stuff, feel free to comment below. And hopefully if I see some questions there that I think are worth answering, I'll get the chance to answer them. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you again soon. Cheers folks.